there any relevance of native speaker norms? That's a question for TEFLologists. Is it better to focus on form or to focus on forms? That's a question for TEFLologists. If you use a textbook, is your classroom authentic, or should your approach be more learner-centric, from feedback to learner autonomy? We'll discuss it all on TEFLology.
Hello and welcome back to the TEFLology Podcast, a podcast all about teaching English as a foreign language and related matters. In this episode, we are very pleased to present an interview with Diane Larsen-Freeman. Professor Larsen-Freeman has had a distinguished and extensive career in the field of second language acquisition, including posts at UCLA, the Graduate SIT Institute, and the University of Michigan, where she is currently a research scientist emerita at the English Language Institute, a professor of education emerita, a professor of linguistics emerita, and a faculty associate of the Center for the Study of Complex Systems. She has also made presentations in countries around the world, is the author of 8 books, and was the editor of the Language Learning Journal for 5 years. Professor Larsen-Freeman focuses her research on the process of second language acquisition and English grammar, looking at how chaos and complexity theory provides new insights into language, its acquisition, and its use. Matt spoke to her after her JELT 2018 plenary presentation titled Including All Students, A Complex Systems Perspective, asking her questions related to complex dynamic systems theory. Enjoy.
So I'm sitting here with Diane Larsen-Freeman. We're at the JELT conference in Shizuoka. Diane, you gave your plenary earlier this morning, and thank you for agreeing to sit down with me. You must be exhausted.
I'm a little tired, a little lagged, but I'm happy to be here, Matthew. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. We often begin our interview podcast by asking guests to briefly describe their career. Could you tell us about your journey in the field of applied linguistics, and maybe you could take us on a journey exploring some of the most important moments that there have been for you.
First of all, when I first began teaching, I did so as a Peace Corps volunteer in Sabah, Malaysia, in Borneo. And although that was a wonderful start to my career, I discovered how much I liked language teaching and learning about language teaching and language learning. It gave me an international perspective and experience. I was dissatisfied with my teaching. I didn't feel like I had really delivered, or maybe that's the wrong verb, but I had really helped my students in the way that I wanted to. And that brought me back to graduate school. And at the time, at the University of Michigan, there was a lot of emphasis on universality. Chomsky had just come of age or made a big scene, made a big, I want to say splash, but that's probably irreverent. He came to prominence and led the cognitive revolution in linguistics. And so I joined in the effort in second language acquisition to look at universality and morpheme acquisition. And although we can look back now and find great fault with that kind of research, I did find one finding that intrigued me, which is that the so-called acquisition order, I prefer to call it an accuracy order since it's cross-sectional, not longitudinal. But nonetheless, I found a very high positive correlation between the order of development in individuals learning morphemes, English morphemes, and the frequency of occurrence of those same morphemes in the language to which they were exposed. And I went, oh, that's so interesting. But at the time, we had just come out of behaviorism, and it seemed like it might be reinforcing the idea that the more frequently you encountered something, the stimulus more frequently would lead to reinforcement and acquisition. But then I realized that actually a cognitive explanation also worked. That is, you could have the more opportunities you had to learn the rule governing a particular form, the more frequently you had that opportunity, the more readily it was acquired. That reason I go on about this is I came to the awareness that frequency was a finding. You still needed a theory to understand and interpret it. A finding without a theory is really not very meaningful. I was also restless with the idea of reductionism, kind of reducing everything to the smallest piece. So I was looking for a bigger frame, and I was looking for a theory that would help me make sense of what I was finding. And I stumbled upon a book by James Blake called Chaos, the Making of a New Science. And I literally, it's a bit of a story about how I came to the book, but I got the book, didn't read it at first, but when I opened it, now you must understand this book had nothing to do with language. It was about systems in nature, natural systems. But I kept reading it and I thought, wow, that's just like language, you know. The act of playing the game as a way of changing the rules he wrote. And he wasn't talking about linguistic rules, but I thought, that's just about language. It's a dynamic system. It's a complex system he wrote. And everything he said just made sense to me, but was totally alien, totally different from the way I'd been trained in universal grammar or generative linguistics.
Yeah.
So those would be sort of the high points. My teaching experience, the fact that I didn't feel I matched my teaching with my students' learning brought me to graduate school. Looking at learning brought me to frequency. Frequency without an interpretation, without a theory to interpret, was meaningless. And then coming across this theory that made a lot of sense and offered an explanation for the frequency. In fact, I'll just take a moment to tell you the story. I was in the Boston Museum of Science and with my family, and they were behind me in the exhibits. I went ahead to the bookstore, and I was just browsing the books. Museum of Science, they were all science books. And a gentleman stopped me while I was browsing and picked a book off the shelf. It was James Blake's book. I didn't know this man. He was a stranger. He handed the book to me, and he said, "Here, you'll enjoy reading this."
Wow.
I mean, that's kind of weird, I know, but I did buy the book. It sat by my bedside, on my bedside table for a while, and I eventually opened it, and it was life-changing, or not life-changing maybe, but certainly a career-changing move.
So that in itself is an example of like the chaos theory, I guess.
Absolutely. It's
the book was about it, and you...
It absolutely
Yeah,
is. Not predictable. These things happen. They're one-off opportunities, and they have the power. These small things have the power to make a difference in my life.
It wasn't the author of that book, though,
Well, it could have been. I don't know what James Blake looks like. But,
Yeah. So I'd like to kind of move on to... I guess before we move on, I'd like to ask if you could define kind of generally or broadly what you mean by complexity, and perhaps as we talked about chaos, how the two differ.
Let me tell you about complexity, and I'm happy for the question, because if I say language is complex or language is a complex adaptive system, everybody nods. But complex, in the way I'm using the term, does not mean complicated. So when you talk about complexity theory, it does not mean a theory of complicated things.
Yes, yeah.
Could be. They could be complicated, but that's not the defining criterion. Complex in complexity theory means it refers to the new patterns that arise from the interaction of the parts of a system, and that complexity emerges, is the term, out of the interaction of the components of a system. So that's what complexity is. So for example, an automobile might be complicated, but it's not complex in the way that I'm talking about, or the way the theory talks. Complex in the way the theory talks has to do with the interaction of the components, giving rise to new patterns at another level of complexity.
Yeah,
if that makes any sense.
I understand, I think I saw you write somewhere you talked about a flock of birds.
Well, that's not my example, but I use it often because it makes a lot of sense to
Yeah,
people.
that was the one that really struck
So you
a
have
chord,
birds, pecking on the ground. You walk by and they take off. There's no one lead bird. They just take off as one. They become a kind of super organism. And so at another level of granularity, you get a different level of complexity.
Yeah.
And they swoop and they avoid obstacles. They come back together again. They act as one. And yet there is no built-in, pre-formulated flight pattern. They just do this. So that is a very an important or a useful example of helping people understand complexity at because it's at different levels, you see.
Do you find that's kind of the best way to go with this theory? Because I think when I first came across these words, they struck me as being quite scary. And do you feel that that's the best way to use these?
Yes, I think, well, here's what I think, that to help people understand it, help myself understand it, I find the images in nature, maybe because I started with Gleig's book, but the theory itself comes from the natural sciences.
Yeah.
Particularly, my particular brand is a biological source. But anyway, I find the images to be what gives people access to the ideas. So I use those. The only drawback to that is that there are people in the field who say, well, a theory from the natural sciences, particularly one that's illustrated with images from nature, may be well and good, but does it really apply to humans? And that's actually why I wound up giving a paper and now publishing a paper on human agency. That's another story. But I think the images can be more profound than the words, right? I mean, people can get the flock of birds in a way that if I talk about self-organizing systems and emergence, it may not be transparent.
In terms of language or second language
yes.
acquisition, how does complexity relate in that sense?
Yeah, well, remember I said I was trained as a Chomskyan linguist, where you had preformationism, you had something that was built in, you had a central directive, which was a set of rules that everybody used to produce and understand novel utterances. In terms of language, what I think it shows is you don't have to have a built-in anything. There's an emergence of order, bottom up, through the interaction of, let's ground it in people. People interacting, using language, don't have to have a built-in anything. It's through the use of language and the exchange and the interaction of people using language that language changes, bottom up, without central direction. There's no template for English or any language. I call it patterns in the flux. The patterns arise because we co-adapt. We imitate, adaptive imitate other people, but it's also creative in the sense that, Harris talked about this. Language is not a fixed code that exists independently of its users, and it's not ready-made either for the users, because every time we use language, we create it, or at least we assemble the conventional units in a different way.
I see.
So leaving the bird flock aside, it's the same image. Instead of birds pecking on the ground, we're people interacting. But out of that interaction, new patterns arrive, just as a flux arises out of the, So, your language resources are different from mine, and yet they overlap considerably because we wouldn't have mutual intelligibility if we didn't. And that's because you and I co-adapt. We adjust our language resources to each other, and you do that with other people, and I do that with other people, and this system evolves from that.
I imagine your theories have found a lot of favour with World English scholars and perhaps ELF scholars.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I published recently an article at the invitation of the editors in the journal World English, and I've done likewise in the journal English as a Lingua Franca, precisely for what you're saying. It suits both of those areas very much to talk about language as a dynamic system. The creation that you see in ELF speakers, in fact, I'll talk about this more tomorrow, but where they use available resources they have to create meaning and communicate, but it's not something that's fixed, right? It's evolving. It's constantly dynamic, constantly changing. It's pretty radical, because what I'm saying really, or not just me, but what the theory says, I think, is that you and I are actually changing English in some ways by using it today. You might go talk to the other Matthew, for instance, and say, well, this is what I talked about with Diane Larsen-Freeman, and then that in itself increases the frequency of certain forms in the exchange that will then eventually feed into the language as a whole, if we can talk about that way.
Definitely. So if we consider language to be a dynamic and adaptive system, what are the implications for areas such as language assessment and proficiency?
That always leaps to mind.
If there's not a fixed set of rules and systems, then
That's a good and obvious question, and I don't know that I have a very satisfying answer. But I will tell you what I do say when that comes up. First of all, I think one-shot exams are problematic because it just gives you a snapshot at one time.
Yeah.
I really think that we need a camcorder or a video of some sort. You need to at least sample multiple times to get some sense of somebody's language resources. So it's what can Matthew do now that he couldn't do before, rather than what does English require at this point, or whatever the language is.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's much more in terms of the developing system within you.
I see. Right.
And then beyond that, I think one possibility is to not only look at language proficiency, but also interactional skills. This is what Harding and McNamara talked about. And here's the other thing, Matthew, is that often language testing or assessment is done not only with one person, but one person with paper and pencil or whatever the computer equivalent is. Whereas language is a social system. It comes out of the interaction of people. So, Tim McNamara and Karsten Rover have written about this. We need to have more social views of language testing. One learner acting on his or her own gives a rather limited picture of one's communicative skills.
Yeah, I see, yeah.
So I think that's another implication. Does that solve the problem of, the fixed exam that everybody needs to pass? No.
Yeah.
No, but I think there are things that one could do if one had the power to bring them about that would make it more compatible.
So it's more about sort of looking from within, like what the learner, for example, how they adapt.
Yes.
And the language that comes out.
Yes.
Right, rather than
having
against.
a measurement against an external native speaker.
I see, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's right.
And that's, I think we're seeing sort of moves away from this.
Well, there's a rebellion, rightfully so, I think,
Yeah.
against this, and I wrote an article on the 40th anniversary of the publication of the article Interlanguage, Larry Selinker's famous article.
yeah,
I wrote
yeah.
an article. They actually had a meeting at Teachers College, Columbia University, where they wanted to honor him. He was there on the 40th anniversary of the publication of that article. And I think it's right that he be honored, and I said so much as my paper, but I titled my paper Interlanguage, Another Step to be Taken, because the end point of the interlanguage continuum is supposedly isomorphism with a native speaker. And I think, certainly with today's sensibilities, we no longer see that as possible or even desirable.
Yeah, I see, yeah. I wanted to ask you about a very different topic, if that's okay.
Yeah.
On the topic of diversity, which you talked about this morning.
Yes.
So I have a student with a disability. She's a deaf learner. And in a recent study, I documented my attempts to be more inclusive of her in my class. But listening to your plenary, perhaps I kind of overlooked the other dynamics. I kind of maybe pigeonholed her as being a deaf learner,
Right.
and put all my eggs in that basket.
Right.
So I guess there's no question there, really.
Well,
How
I can comment, though.
How can I avoid
comment. I mean, I think we do this out of a felt need to try to support our students, and I think that's very noble. But you do, if you focus on the student, well, that's not to say you shouldn't try to create a relationship with the student that meets the student's needs, but it can't be a one-way street. That's what I would say. If you have a relationship, it has to be reciprocal. So
yeah.
what did she contribute to you, and how were you changed by that experience, and what did she contribute to the other students, and vice versa?
Yeah.
And did she bring strengths in other regards that could be tapped for the sake of everybody's learning that might have been overlooked in an attempt to try to make things right for her?
Yeah.
So that's part of the bigger picture.
Yeah.
So it's not wrong to do that. I mean, I think that if you went out of your way, or it's part of your way, was to try to support her learning, my goodness, that's a wonderful thing. But you can't stop there, you see, because then you become judging her and acting towards her as the exception rather
Yeah,
than
I
as
see.
part of a
Yeah.
functioning,
Yeah.
contributing member of the class.
I see, yeah. I think maybe I need to go back and have a look and maybe take a more complexity view of things, perhaps.
Yeah, if it makes sense to you, Matthew, that's all. I'm not a proselytizer.
But, yeah.
All you can do is
Trying
talk about what's interesting to you
Definitely,
and how
yeah,
you see
sure,
the world.
Yeah. So a complexity view of second language learning development takes into account adaptability, emergence, dynamicism, I can't even say that word, but
You're doing fine.
I'm adaptive.
Dynamism.
Ecology and interconnectedness.
Mm-hmm.
Language teachers, of course, are still important in this process
Absolutely.
too. How can language teachers take complexity into account in their classrooms and make this a more kind of pronounced feature?
Yeah, so I think this is going to sound maybe pretty radical. I think it is, which is that I no longer use words like input. I don't think it's a question of teachers giving students input or comprehensible input. First of all, that denies the learner any kind of agency because it's always being given to them. But I don't think that's the way people learn. I think rather what the teacher should be doing from a complexity theory perspective is helping the students to build a relationship between language and themselves. It's a relational theory. So it's not a question of aggregation of atoms of language in a sequential or even non-sequential way. It's a question of how do I make meaning, how can I help my students make meaning in a way that they want to, using whatever language resources are available to them, and have this relationship with the language and with the person with whom they're speaking. I don't know if that makes any sense, but I think it's a relational view.
Yeah, and how, I mean, in a practical sense, how could that be realized?
One of the issues of complexity theory is I think it's so terribly profound. It's really altered the way I think in a radical way. But then there's also part of me that says it's very banal, because don't teachers do this already in some ways? It resonates with teachers because I think it is sort of commonsensical. So how do teachers do that? I think that, I mean, this is probably not very realistic, but how about abandoning the syllabus, and this is not realistic, and just letting the students, whatever kind of language resources, even ranked beginners, no one's totally a beginner in English these days, and start to use what they have and use that. And I call it an organic syllabus. Use that as a way to move forward. So you're relating to what the students bring with them and moving on from that, as opposed to coming in with a preordained or preconfigured syllabus.
So you're kind of uncovering rather than covering, I guess. That's
Yeah. And then also, since relationships are so important, how can you move on from that in a way that is satisfying to the students? How can you build that relationship? You know, I spoke earlier this morning, you alluded to it. They say that speaking before large audiences is the single most threatening or stressful activity that somebody can do. And I think the reason is because in a large audience, it's difficult to establish a relationship. You know, it's like that first day of class. I don't care how much of a veteran teacher you are. That first day of class, it's always a little bit scary because you have yet to establish a relationship with people. So it's a relationship between teacher and students, between teacher and material, between students and material or content, between each other. It's managing the relationship, managing the learning rather than the syllabus or the content or even the learners.
Yeah. So already that's a very complex
Yeah,
situation anyway.
Teaching isn't easy.
No,
No one said it's easy. I don't think this theory makes teaching any easier, but I think it's more authentic.
I see. Yeah, that's a good way to look at it, I guess, and approach it, perhaps. Yeah.
Right.
Perhaps a couple more questions, if that's okay. So, from reading your thoughts on complexity theory, perhaps to take it to a different area of our field, I guess. It seems that almost every area of scientific inquiry has at some point explored these characteristics.
Yes.
So you talked about nature earlier.
Yes.
So thinking about our field of applied linguistics as a complex dynamic system, well, first of all, is that possible? Have I missed the point? And how could this theory be used as a way to kind of describe relations between researchers, teachers, and theoretical ideas?
Well, systems can all a system is a collection of components that interact, but in a meaningful way, right? They're not, as I said, an automobile. I guess the parts interact in some ways, but they take their character from each other. They're defined relationally from each other. So, can the field be considered a complex adaptive system? I don't see why not. I mean, in other words, there are systems within systems within systems, and I don't see why a field itself can't be. It's made of a number of participants who collectively interact at conferences or whatever, and out of that becomes a canon of publications and ideas. I mean, I guess I haven't really thought about that so much, but I see systems everywhere. What you also said, though, I think that's important, is that because complexity theory has been widely applied to a number of different disciplines, it has actually given applied linguists the discourse with which they can engage others. You know, it's actually no longer do we have to be as isolated a field, because many fields are now talking about this theory or some semblance of it. And so it's given us a transdisciplinary discourse that lets us join a larger group, larger community of scholars. I think that's really important. You know, Donald Freeman and I wrote an article on post-disciplinarity, thinking that maybe we're entering an era where disciplinary knowledge is no longer important or no longer the only word. And if you start to look at what's happening in the disciplines, you see a lot of hyphenated disciplines, so psychobiology and these kinds of things. And I think that's an attempt, although not a conscious one, to try to break down these separate disciplines and see the whole thing as well.
And maybe just to kind of bring everything together. So in Kees de Bot's A History of Applied Linguistics,
yes,
you're described as being one of the few applied linguists who have worked in the teaching practice area and fundamental research. So what's kind of motivated you to work across these two areas? And would you say it's been a challenge to kind of be part of this dialogue or maintain this dialogue?
Yeah, you're right. There aren't, and Kay's is right, there aren't so many people that are interested in this. I think a few things from me. One is that I started as a language teacher. I consider myself a teacher. I think there are a lot of people in higher education who wouldn't say that as their first identity, but I consider myself a teacher. I had studied as an undergraduate. I had studied theories of learning because I was really interested in learning, and then I found language and teaching to be so satisfying. But my goal was to teach language in harmony with my students' natural learning proclivities. So that's number one, is that I see the interchange or the interchange between teaching and learning as being fundamental to everything I do. So that's true of my research. That's certainly true of what I do in the classroom. I sometimes understand, even complexity theory, there are things about complexity theory I understand with my teacher mind. And that so I don't see it as a bifurcation. I see it as quite a unity. I also consider myself to be an applied linguist, and I take from Chris Brumfitt and others our moral responsibility to try to do what we can do to be better for our learners. And again, that doesn't mean I'm not in a position to prescribe practice to teachers, but I do think that I shouldn't be just in an ivory tower. I think I should try to find ways that better meet the needs of my learners. And I said this before, I like what Gert Biesta has written, that research can tell us what has worked, but it can't tell us what works. And I think suggesting that teachers have to cultivate a disposition of inquiry as well. So I don't, there are political separations, and there certainly are remuneration separations, and there's certain status separation perhaps, but I think that fundamentally both research and teaching are best practiced when we cultivate attitudes of inquiry.
Right, I see.
And I see, for me, that's the connection.
That's the connection, I see, Okay, well, I think that's a really nice place to end it. So thank you, Diane.
You're welcome,
for your time.
Matthew. Thank you for
really
inviting me, and thank you for your excellent questions.
Thank you.
Thank you once again to Diane Larsen-Freeman for sitting down and talking to us. We hope you enjoyed listening to her ideas as much as we did. As always, if you'd like to get in touch with us, we'd love to hear from you. You can email us at TEFLology@gmail.com. You can find us on Twitter @TEFLology, and we also have a Facebook page. We also have a book, Podcasting and Professional Development, a guide for English language teachers, which is available through Amazon. Thank you for listening, and we'll be back soon with another episode.